She had always known that proving herself among men who had been hardened by decades of combat experience would not be easy, but she never imagined the sting of being dismissed outright by those who should have recognized her worth. When Captain Elena went to the SEAL training compound for the first time, she carried with her years of preparation, unyielding discipline, and a burning desire to serve her country at the highest level. Yet the commanders looked at her not with respect but with skepticism, whispering about how she was only there because of a political decision or a diversity experiment. They dismissed her capabilities without ever giving her a real chance, and though the words were unspoken, their eyes said it all: she didn't belong. Elena tried not to let it wound her, but deep inside, it fueled a fire that would one day prove unstoppable. Training days were brutal. Men twice her size sparred against her, expecting her to break, but every time she fell, she rose again. She remembered her father's words, a veteran who had raised her after her mother's death: "Pain is just proof you're still in the fight." She carried those words like armor. Yet no matter how much she excelled, outswimming rivals, holding her breath longer, firing with pinpoint precision, she was still looked at as an outsider. Her superiors shook their heads, muttering that combat wasn't a place for her. She was strong, yes, but in their eyes, strength wasn't enough. Leadership dismissed her name from operation rosters again and again, placing her in secondary positions, paperwork, or standby roles. Each rejection cut deeper than the last, but it also sharpened her resolve. She trained in secret, long after others had retired to the bus. At night she would run drills, assemble and reassemble her rifle blindfolded, practice tactical maneuvers with nothing but shadows as her partners, and push her body past the limits of exhaustion. Her hands blistered, her muscles screamed, yet she welcomed every ounce of pain because she knew pain was temporary but victory would last forever. Still, the sting of being dismissed weighed on her. She heard one commander sneer, "She'll never last in the field, she'll fold under pressure," and another laugh, "War doesn't care about equality, it cares about killers." Those words haunted her, echoing like a dare she couldn't ignore. Fate, however, has a way of testing those prepared in silence. The mission came suddenly, an ambush on Allied forces in a desolate valley where insurgents were hours away, and the SEAL team dispatched was pinned down under heavy fire. Elena had been ordered to remain behind on base support duty, but when news came that her team was trapped and surrounded, something in her snapped. Disobedience meant court-martial, disgrace, maybe even prison, but letting them die without lifting a hand was something she could never live with. Grabbing her gear, strapping on her vest, and loading her rifle, she moved with a calm fury. No hesitation, no second thoughts. She boarded a transport vehicle under the cover of night and made her way toward the valley, every heartbeat sinking with the thought that this was her moment, the moment no one could take from her. The closer she came, the heavier the gunfire echoed through the canyon walls, tracer rounds lighting up the night like angry fireflies. She crept through the rocks, her body moving with precision, her breath measured, her heartbeat steady. This was what she had trained for, what she had bled for, even if no one believed in her. And then she saw them. Enemies scattered across the ridge, 15 heavily armed fighters raining bullets on her pinned brothers. Her team was trapped behind a crumbling wall, their ammo nearly gone. If something wasn't done, they would be slaughtered. For a moment, Elena closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, and let her training take over. Every drill she had done in secret, every hour she had endured humiliation, every scar, every drop of sweat, it all converged into this single moment. She whispered under her breath, not as a prayer but as a promise, "They'll never dismiss me again." And then she moved. Like a shadow breaking free from the dark, she scaled the rocks to higher ground, slipping through cover with the grace of a predator. Her rifle realized death was among them. She didn't pause. Her hands were steady, her aim true, each pull of the trigger a lesson carved into the marrow of her being. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks, confusion spreading as they tried to locate her. They were trained, but they were not ready for a ghost in the night. She shifted positions constantly, firing from new angles, making it seem like an entire squad had arrived. The first 5 fell before a minute had passed. She moved lower, switching to her knife when one fighter stumbled too close. Her blade was swift, silent, merciless. Blood stained her gloves, but her eyes remained cold, her focus unbroken. She was not here for glory, not for recognition. She was here because her team's lives depended on her. And in that moment she was no longer the dismissed woman, no longer the outsider. She was death itself. Her brothers watched in stunned disbelief as enemies dropped one after another. They had mocked her, doubted her, dismissed her, but now their eyes widened with awe and something deeper, respect. Within 5 minutes, 15 enemies lay motionless on the rocky ground, their weapons scattered, their blood soaking into the dirt. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the ragged breaths of the surviving SEALs who realized they had just been saved. Elena stood tall, chest heaving, rifle still warm in her hands. Her face was streaked with sweat and grime, but her eyes burned with quiet defiance. She didn't need their praise. She didn't need their acceptance. In those 5 minutes she had proven to herself, and to the world, that she belonged not because someone allowed her in, but because she had taken her place by force. The commanders had dismissed her, but destiny had not. The valley was quiet now, the silence almost unnatural after the storm of bullets and blood. Elena could feel the weight of 15 bodies on her shoulders, not as guilt but as proof of what she was capable of. She knew that every second of hesitation she might have allowed earlier could have meant the death of her team, and that thought alone steeled her resolve even further. She turned back toward the crumbling wall where the SEALs had been taking cover, her boots crunching softly on gravel as she approached. Their faces were a mix of shock and disbelief, eyes wide as if they were looking at someone they thought they knew but no longer recognized. She had been the soldier dismissed, ignored, laughed at in the mess hall when she tried to contribute to planning sessions, but now she was the reason they were breathing. One of them, Ortiz, his arm wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, whispered, You did that?" The woman before him with the ghost that had dismantled 15 fighters in minutes. Elena simply gave a short nod. Words would cheapen what had just happened. She helped him to his feet, her strength surprising him, and without a pause she began distributing spare magazines she had carried. She hadn't just come for a moment of glory, she had come prepared to fight beside them until the end. Still, she could sense the shift in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement that she had earned what no commander's decision could grant her. Respect wasn't given, it was taken, and tonight she had seized it. But the mission wasn't over. Far from it. The valley was just the outer line of a larger enemy force, and though she had broken the ambush, reinforcements would come. Distant echoes of engines confirmed her fears, trucks rumbling in the night, bringing more fighters who would discover their death soon enough. She glanced at the team leader, Lieutenant Cross, whose pride had often been the sharpest blade cutting into her confidence during training. Now his eyes met hers differently, no longer dismissive but uncertain, as if weighing whether to resist or embrace the truth he had just witnessed. "We move," Elena said firmly, her voice steady, commanding. For a second there was hesitation, then Cross gave a sharp nod. The team fell in, following her lead without protest, and in that moment she understood that leadership wasn't granted by rank but by action. She had shown them who she was, and now they trusted her to lead them out of hell. The group moved swiftly through the jagged canyon, shadows their only cover, their breaths measured and quiet. Elena kept scanning ahead, her ears tuned to every shift in the wind, every crunch of gravel that didn't belong to their own boots. She had always trained herself to listen beyond the obvious, to notice what others overlooked, and that skill now kept them alive. Twice she raised her fist, halting the team just in time to avoid enemy patrols sweeping the ridge. Her quick decisions saved them from walking into certain death, and slowly the doubt in the men's faces turned into reliance. They were beginning to look to her as the point of survival, not an outsider forced into their ranks. Hours stretched like years as they navigated deeper into the rugged terrain. The stars above were cold and indifferent, shining down on a battlefield where human lives flickered like candles in the wind. Elena felt the ache in her legs, the sting of cuts across her arms, but she buried the pain beneath layers of willpower. Her father's voice echoed in her mind again, "The fight doesn't end until you say it does." She whispered those words silently, drawing strength from them as her body threatened to give in. At one point, they reached a dried riverbed that cut like a scar through the canyon. It offered both danger and opportunity. If they followed it, they could use its curves as cover, but if enemy scouts were already stationed there, it would be a death trap. Cross turned to her, waiting for her judgment. It was a moment she never thought she would have, his eyes seeking hers not in disdain but in trust. She crouched low, pressed her palm against the earth, and studied the faint impressions left in the dust. Tire tracks, boot prints, some fresh, some fading. Her instincts told her there had been movement here recently, but not enough to suggest a full squad still remained. She signaled the team forward. The decision proved right. They slipped through the riverbed undetected, the sound of trucks and shouting in the distance confirming that enemy forces were combing the ridges above instead. painting the rocks with shades of gold and crimson. The team had put several miles between themselves and the valley of death. Exhaustion tugged at all of them, but survival carried their bodies forward. Elena felt her chest tighten with something unspoken. Not pride, not relief, but a quiet certainty that the hardest part was still ahead. She had saved them once, but in war, one victory only bought time until the next battle. They stopped in a shallow cave to rest, taking turns keeping watch. As Elena sat with her back against the stone, rifle across her lap, Ortiz leaned over and whispered, "I was wrong about you." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of every doubt, every sneer, every dismissal she had endured. She didn't smile, didn't thank him. Instead, she only said, "We're not done yet." Because she knew respect wasn't earned in a single night, it had to be proven again and again until no one dared question it. The sound of helicopters soon filled the air, heavy blades chopping the wind. Relief surged through the team. Extraction had finally arrived. But as Elena scanned the sky, something in her gut twisted. These weren't friendly birds. The silhouettes were wrong, the noise too heavy. Enemy gunships. Trap. Before she could shout a warning, missiles streaked toward their position, detonating just outside the cave. The world exploded in fire and dust, the ground shaking as if the earth itself wanted to swallow them whole. Chaos erupted, men coughing and stumbling, rocks crashing down from the ceiling. Elena threw herself over Ortiz, shielding him from falling debris, her ears ringing as the cave threatened to collapse. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The cave shook, each impact echoing like thunder against Elena's skull. Her ears rang with the force of the explosion outside, but her instincts screamed louder than the pain. Move or die. She shoved Ortiz toward a pocket of cover as another blast rocked the ground, the fire outside painting the cave entrance in searing orange light. The team scrambled, weapons clattering, voices hoarse with shouted warnings that were nearly drowned out by the roar of enemy gunships circling overhead. Elena pressed herself low against the ground, dragging her rifle close, every muscle tense as she tried to calculate their survival. Trapped in a cave with collapsing walls and enemies raining fire from above, this was no rescue mission. It was an execution. She could see Cross struggling to rally the men, but panic was in their eyes. They had fought all night, bloodied and exhausted. Now death loomed in the smoke-filled air. Elena's mind sharpened into focus, her thoughts slicing through fear like a blade through cloth. She crawled toward the entrance, ignoring the sting of debris cutting across her arms, and peered outside. The gunships hovered like vultures above, their cannons spitting rounds into the canyon walls, trying to flush them out. She could count 2, maybe 3 of them, their black silhouettes framed against the pale light of dawn. Their enemies weren't just sending ground forces now. They wanted the SEAL team obliterated before reinforcements could arrive. She gritted her teeth, fury boiling in her veins, not just at the threat but at the thought of being dismissed once again if she didn't rise here. This was the crucible where legends were born, and she refused to let her story end buried in rubble. With quick motions, she signaled the others to stay low, then scavenged through their gear until she found what she needed: 2 shoulder-mounted rockets, emergency reserves the team had carried for vehicle strikes. Cross stared at her as she hefted the heavy weapon onto her shoulder, his voice raw from dust. "You're insane, you'll never hit them before they cut you down." She met his gaze with eyes like tempered steel. "Watch me." She sprinted out into the open, bullets tearing the ground around her, shards of rock slicing her skin as gunfire rained from above. The air burned with heat, but her hands were steady, her breath locked into the rhythm she had drilled into herself. Night after night. She fired once, the missile streaking into the sky like a furious comet. It struck the tail of the nearest gunship, the explosion ripping through its hull and sending it spinning into the canyon wall. Flames blossomed across the rock face as the wreckage plummeted to the ground. Cheers erupted behind her, but she didn't pause. She dropped to one knee, loaded the second rocket, and fired again before the remaining choppers could adjust their aim. The missile smashed into the cockpit of the second gunship, tearing it apart in a ball of fire that lit up the morning sky. Debris rained down like hellfire, the shockwave almost knocking her off her feet. But even as smoke and flames filled the air, the third helicopter banked sharply, its cannon swiveling toward her exposed position. Elena rolled hard, dirt scraping her cheek as the ground erupted where she had just stood. She scrambled to her rifle, lifted it, and fired burst after burst at the cockpit, not expecting to pierce armor but buying time. The gunship's cannon thundered, tearing massive craters into the earth. She knew she had seconds, maybe less, before it lined up a fatal shot. Then Cross appeared beside her, dragging another launcher into place. For the first time, his not doubt but conviction. "You started this. Finish it." She took the weapon, her muscles screaming under its weight, and aimed with every ounce of focus she had left. The helicopter veered, spitting death, but Elena squeezed the trigger. The rocket screamed upward, cutting through the rising smoke and fire, and slammed directly into the belly of the gunship. The explosion was deafening, a wave of heat and force that threw her backward onto the rocky ground. For a moment there was only ringing silence, a strange emptiness as smoke curled into the dawn sky. Then the wreckage came crashing down, a burning hulk scattering fire and twisted metal across the canyon floor. The earth trembled and then there was stillness. The men erupted in shouts, a mixture of relief and disbelief, staring at the three machines that had tried to end them. Her eyes stared upward with unbroken fire. She had done what no one thought possible. Cross crouched beside her, gripping her arm tightly. "You saved us again," he said, his voice thick. "You're the reason any of us are still alive." For once there was no sarcasm, no sneer, only the raw truth. But Elena didn't reply. She pushed herself up, ignoring the tremor in her limbs, and scanned the horizon. Smoke plumes rose in the distance, signaling that enemy forces were regrouping. This was far from over. "We move," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for debate. And they moved, following her without question. Hours dragged as they wound through broken terrain, every step haunted by the echo of explosions, every shadow threatening new danger. Their water supplies ran low, munitions scarcer still, but Elena carried them forward with her unrelenting will. When exhaustion slowed their pace, she set hers harder, forcing them to match her stride. When despair clouded their eyes, she reminded them of what they had survived, of the fire they had already walked through. Slowly they began to believe not just in survival but in victory. That night, as they huddled in the shelter of a jagged ridge, Ortiz whispered to the others when he thought Elena was asleep, "She's not just one of us. She's more." His words carried in the silence, reaching her ears though her eyes remained closed. She didn't smile, didn't move, but deep inside, something long buried stirred, an acknowledgement that for the first time she wasn't fighting to prove her worth anymore. She had already proven it. Yet even as sleep pulled at her, her mind refused rest. The war was not done, their mission incomplete. A man back at base would demand answers. She had disobeyed direct orders, broken protocol, and vanished into a battlefield she was never meant to touch. And yet, without her, they all would have been corpses in the dust. She wondered how the commanders would look at her now. Would they admit they were wrong, or would they cling to their pride? It didn't matter. The truth was written in the burning wrecks of 3 gunships and the 15 men who had fallen by her hand. Dismissed or not, she had carved her place in history with blood and fire. And the war still waited. The desert night was cruel, its wind slicing through the team's worn bodies as they huddled against the ridge for shelter, their breaths forming pale clouds under the cold stars. Elena sat slightly apart, her rifle balanced across her lap, eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could burn through the darkness with sheer will. Sleep would not come to her, not because her body did crave, but because her mind refused to surrender. Every sound in the distance, every whisper of shifting sand, every faint crack of rock sent her senses flaring. She had survived too much, fought too hard to let vigilance slip now. The others dozed in scattered clusters, some murmuring in restless dreams, others sitting with heads bowed in exhaustion, but she kept her back straight, the weight of responsibility pressing harder than the gear strapped to her body. She thought of her commanders, of the way they had looked at her when they dismissed her, their voices dripping with certainty that she would never make it through the chaos of war. She imagined their expressions now if they could see her, leading a team of men who once doubted her, dragging them back from death again and again. A bitter laugh threatened to escape her throat, but she swallowed it. There was no time for pride. Pride got soldiers killed. She forced her focus back to the task at hand. Survival until extraction or until the mission was done, whichever came first. As dawn bled across the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Elena woke the others with a sharp word and a shove. They rose sluggishly, groaning, but when their eyes found hers, they stood straighter. Even Cross, hardened and stubborn, moved without complaint. She studied them as they assembled, noting the bruises, the cuts, the hollowness in their eyes. They were running on fumes now, but she knew what kept them moving wasn't food or water. It was the unspoken belief that if she was still standing, so could they. She shouldered her pack and set the pace, pushing them out of the ridge and into the wasteland once more. By midday the heat was merciless, baking the sand into shimmering waves that distorted the horizon. Sweat stung her eyes, her tongue thick and dry, but she refused to slow. When Ortiz stumbled, she caught him by the vest and dragged him forward until his legs found rhythm again. When Mason cursed under his breath about dying in the middle of nowhere, she snapped back at him, her voice sharp and commanding, reminding him that death only claimed those who surrendered. Her words weren't gentle, but they lit sparks in tired eyes, sparks that burned just enough to keep moving. They reached an abandoned outpost by late afternoon, its walls crumbling, its roof half collapsed, but it was shelter, and that was enough. Elena ordered them inside, checking every corner for traps before letting the others rest. She stood at the doorway, scanning the horizon once more. It was too quiet. War zones were never this quiet unless silence was a mask for something worse. She felt it in her gut, the instinct honed by endless drills and sharpened by the battles of the past days. Trouble was coming. And it came, shot back through the air, shattering the silence like glass. Dust kicked up inches from her boot, the bullet embedding itself in the wall behind her. "Sniper!" she barked, diving for cover as the others scrambled into defensive positions. The outpost erupted in chaos, bullets slamming into its walls, enemy shouts carrying across the barren land. They had been tracked, hunted, and now the wolves were at their door. Elena gritted her teeth as adrenaline surged. She crawled toward the nearest window, spotted the faint glint of a rifle scope in the distance, and squeezed off 3 quick shots. The glint disappeared, a scream echoing faintly across the sand. One down, but there were more. Shadows moved on the horizon, a full squad advancing with ruthless precision. She counted at least 20, maybe more, their weapons flashing in the light as they closed in. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and barely standing, but surrender was not in her blood. "Hold your fire until they're closer," she commanded, her tone cutting through fear. The men obeyed, eyes fixed on her, waiting. She felt the weight of their trust like a blade across her back, sharp and heavy. When the enemy drew close enough that she could see the determination in their eyes, she gave the order. The outpost roared to life, rifles barking in unison, grenades arcing through the air to burst among the attackers. Sand and smoke filled the battlefield, bodies dropping, cries of rage and pain tearing through the chaos. Elena moved like fire through the wreckage of the outpost, firing, reloading, striking with brutal precision. She no longer thought about what her commanders would say, or what the men around her once believed. She was past proving herself. She was the storm now. Bullets grazed her shoulder, sliced across her leg, but she ignored the pain, every nerve focused on tearing down the tide of enemies before them. One by one they fell, but still more came. The outpost walls crumbled further under the assault, dust and debris choking the air. Cross shouted for more ammo, Ortiz cursed as his rifle jammed, and Mason screamed in pain as shrapnel tore into his arm. Elena grabbed him, pulled him behind cover, shoved a pistol into his good hand and roared, "You're not done yet." Her fury lit sparks in the broken soldier's eyes, and he returned fire with grim determination. Minutes stretched like eternity, the fight a blur of smoke and fire, until at last the enemy began to falter. Their numbers dwindled under the relentless defense, and those who remained pulled back, dragging their wounded, retreating into the horizon. The battlefield fell silent once more, broken only by the ragged gasps of the SEAL team as they sagged against the ruined walls. Elena leaned against a shattered beam, chest heaving, sweat and blood streaking her face. She had no idea how many they had killed, only that they were still alive. That was victory enough. Cross approached her slowly, his face smeared with dirt and exhaustion, his eyes carrying something she had never seen from him before, absolute respect. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The look said everything. She had not only saved them again but led them through fire and hell, and they knew now that she was no longer the woman dismissed from the roster. She was the one they would follow anywhere, even into the jaws of death. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence wash over her, but she knew it would last. More enemies would come, more battles would rage, and she would into the dust and blood of war. She belonged here not because someone allowed her, but because she had claimed it with unbreakable will. And the war was far from over. The night was thick with tension, and every second that passed felt like it was loaded with unseen danger. Sarah had no room for mistakes now because the mission had shifted from survival to rescue, and she knew that hesitation would cost not only her life but the lives of others depending on her. The information she had pulled from the enemy camp revealed something even the SEAL commanders had not anticipated. The enemies were not just a small splinter group but part of a much larger, highly coordinated network, and they were holding 3 American intelligence officers in an underground bunker less than 5 miles away. Sarah was already battered from the earlier fight where she had taken down 15 enemies in just 5 minutes, but her resolve was steel, sharper and more unbreakable than ever. Every muscle in her body carried the burn of exhaustion, yet her eyes remained fixed with fire, scanning the treeline as she adjusted her rifle and pushed deeper into hostile ground. She moved through the forest with the silence of a predator, her breath steady, her heartbeat controlled as though she had trained her body to become a machine of endurance. Somewhere behind her, she knew that a small team of enemy survivors would eventually regroup, but her path was forward, not back. She crawled under branches slick with dew, scaled a rocky ridge with her bare hands despite the cuts forming across her palms, and paused only long enough to orient herself against the faint glow of enemy torches in the distance. The bunker would be guarded, that much she knew, but what the SEAL commanders had dismissed earlier was her intuition, an intuition that had saved her countless times before. She rescue had to happen tonight, while the enemy was still reeling from the chaos she had unleashed. As she crept closer, the enemy compound began to emerge from the shadows like a beast crouched in the darkness. Tall fences lined with rusted barbed wire surrounded the entrance, and 2 guards patrolled lazily near the gate, unaware of the storm about to descend upon them. Sarah crouched behind a cluster of rocks, studying their movements, memorizing the rhythm of their steps, the way their rifles hung carelessly, the brief seconds when they turned their backs at the same time. It was all she needed. With calm precision, she pulled a throwing knife from her belt, balanced it between her fingers and waited for the guard to step into the perfect angle. The blade flew like lightning, embedding itself into the guard's neck before he could make a sound, and Sarah was already moving, sprinting low and fast. He turned in confusion, his eyes widening as he raised his weapon, but Sarah tackled him to the ground, slammed his head against the dirt, and silenced him forever with a swift, controlled strike. The entrance was clear, but her mission had only just begun. Inside, the bunker was lit with dim bulbs that flickered like nervous eyes, shadows dancing across the concrete walls. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, listening, hearing the footsteps of patrols echoing faintly through the corridors. She counted them, 2 sets moving away from her and 1 heavier pair standing still at a door ahead. She knew instinctively that the prisoners were behind that door, and she knew equally well that any delay meant those prisoners could be moved or executed. She had no backup, no communication to call for reinforcements, but she did not need them. She steadied her breathing, checked her rifle, and whispered to herself a simple phrase that had guided her through every impossible mission: precision, speed, resolve. With those words she burst forward. The 2 patrolling enemies didn't even have time to register her presence before she shot them down with silenced rounds, their bodies dropping noiselessly onto the cold floor. She darted forward, low and fast, closing the distance toward the heavy guard at the door. He heard the muffled noise behind him and began raising his weapon, but Sarah slid across the floor in one fluid motion, her knife flashing as it tore across his thigh and sent him staggering. She was on her feet in an instant, disarming him with brutal efficiency, her elbow striking his jaw before she slammed him against the wall and snapped his neck in a single clean movement. The silence returned, but now the door loomed in front of her. She pressed her ear against it, hearing the faint, muffled cries of men inside. Without wasting another moment, she planted a small explosive from her pack along the lock, took 3 steps back and detonated it with a quick flash. The blast was controlled but effective and the door swung open. Inside, 3 American officers sat chained and battered, their eyes widening in disbelief as they saw her silhouette appear like a phantom savior. "Who the hell?" one of them began, but she cut him off sharply. "I'm your way out. Stay quiet, stay behind me and don't question anything." There was no room for debate. With swift strikes of her knife, she cut their chains, pulled them to their feet and motioned for them to follow. But the explosion had drawn attention, and Sarah knew the storm was about to crash down on them. Alarms blared through the bunker, heavy boots thundered across the floors, and voices shouted orders in a language sharp with anger. Sarah led the officers through the narrow corridors, firing short bursts to drop enemies that appeared from side passages. Bullets sparked off walls, grenades rattled across the floor, and yet Sarah remained unshaken, moving with the speed and certainty of someone who had lived her entire life inside moments like these. She shielded the prisoners with her own body, dragging them through cover, firing relentlessly, striking down anyone who dared block their escape. By the time they reached the exit, Sarah had left behind a trail of destruction so severe that even the officers, hardened men of intelligence, could hardly believe they were watching a single soldier carve through an army. Her body burned with fatigue, her shoulders screamed with pain, but she never slowed. When they burst through the gate into the open air, the night seemed to crack with freedom, though dozens of enemies still swarmed from the treeline. Sarah didn't falter. She set her jaw, raised her rifle, and unleashed a torrent of fire so precise and merciless that the enemies fell one after another, never getting closer than a few desperate feet. She guided the officers into the forest, forcing them forward, until finally the compound disappeared behind them. Only when they reached the cover of the ridge did Sarah allow herself to pause, her chest heaving, her body slick with sweat and blood. The officers stared at her in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what they had just survived. One of them finally spoke, his voice shaking. "You're not SEALs? Who are you?" Sarah gave him a tired, almost defiant smile. "Someone they dismissed. But now you know why that was their mistake." And with that, she led them further into the forest, already thinking about the next fight, because she knew this war was far from over. The forest was dark, the moon a pale witness above the jagged trees, and Sarah kept moving, every sense sharpened, every step calculated. Behind her, the three rescued officers stumbled through branches and uneven ground, their breath ragged, but she gave them no chance to collapse. Survival did not allow for weakness, and Sarah knew the enemy would not let this humiliation stand. By now, radio chatter had already spread across their network, alerting every outpost within miles that an unknown operative had infiltrated, slaughtered their men and stolen their prisoners. She expected pursuit, and that expectation kept her adrenaline surging, her finger tight against the trigger of her rifle as her eyes darted through the shadows. The night felt alive with threats, and every shifting branch, every whisper of wind carried weight. They reached a ravine, and Sarah motioned for silence, holding up her fist. The officers obeyed instantly, as though they sensed that any sound could draw death upon them. She crouched near the edge, eyes sweeping across the valley below. In the faint moonlight, she saw what she had expected: enemy vehicles moving in formation, headlights slicing through the dark like hunting spears, soldiers pouring into the forest with dogs and rifles. They were fanning out, tightening the circle. Sarah's mind worked rapidly, calculating paths, distances, timing. She could not simply run and hope. She had to outthink them, strike with the same precision that had allowed her to take down 15 men in 5 minutes. She turned to the officers, her voice low and steady. "You follow my lead. You don't question. You don't speak. You do exactly as I say, or none of us will make it." Their nods were hesitant but desperate, their eyes wide with the realization that this woman, this soldier who the SEAL commanders had dismissed, was their only chance of survival. Without another word, Sarah guided them along the ridge, staying low, her body moving like part of the earth itself. She led them through a hidden deer path that cut into the forest, forcing them to crawl under roots, slide across damp soil, and wade silently through a shallow creek to erase their scent from the tracking dogs. Every move was deliberate, every choice grounded in hard-earned experience. For nearly an hour they moved this way, and for nearly an hour the enemy continued to close in. Gunshots cracked in the distance, followed by sharp commands and the sound of dogs barking closer and closer. Sarah's pace quickened, though she showed no panic. She paused only once to kneel in the dirt, pressing her ear to the ground. The vibrations told her what she feared. A second squad had circled ahead, trying to cut them off. They were being herded like prey, but Sarah was no prey. She stood slowly, eyes narrowed, with unshakable resolve. If the enemy wanted a trap, she would turn the trap against them. She led the group into a rocky gorge where towering cliffs pressed close on either side. The officers looked uneasy, recognizing that this was a choke point with little room to maneuver, but Sarah's mind was already weaving a plan. She planted them against the wall, motioning for them to stay down, then moved to gather whatever the environment offered her. She picked up heavy stones, wedged them into narrow cracks overhead, and rigged them with wire from her pack, turning the natural terrain into a death trap. Her hands moved quickly, each motion efficient, as though she had done this 100 times before. The officers watched in silence, realizing that her knowledge went beyond weapons and tactics. She understood how to turn the land itself into a weapon. Minutes later, the enemy squad entered the air. Weapons raised. Sarah waited in the shadows, her body pressed against stone, her eyes locked onto the pattern of their movements. She let them advance just far enough, let their numbers pile into the choke point, and then she pulled the wire. A thunderous crash followed as rocks tumbled down like the wrath of the earth itself, crushing soldiers beneath, scattering the rest into disarray. Before they could recover, Sarah emerged from the darkness with deadly precision. Her rifle barked in controlled bursts, every shot finding its target, every movement a blur of lethal intent. The officers huddled against the wall, eyes wide as they watched her dismantle an entire squad with nothing but calm, ruthless efficiency. When the echoes of battle faded, the gorge was silent again, littered with bodies and debris. No time without the victory. She quickly retrieved ammunition from the fallen, checked her rifle, and motioned for the officers to move. They obeyed instantly, following her like shadows, their earlier skepticism replaced by absolute trust. She had saved them again, and they knew now that without her, they would have already been dead. But Sarah knew the fight was not over. The enemy was vast and she was only one. To win, she would have to stay 3 steps ahead at all times. As they pushed deeper into the forest, dawn began to creep across the horizon, washing the sky in shades of pale blue and gray. The light brought no comfort, only greater risk of detection. Sarah found a concealed cave carved into the side of a hill and led them inside, finally allowing the officers a moment to rest. Their faces were pale, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. Cradled in her arms, her eyes fixed outward. She did not allow herself rest, not yet. The mission was not complete until these men were returned safely to Allied lines, and until then she carried their survival on her shoulders. Inside the cave, one of the officers finally spoke, his voice hushed but full of awe. "They said you weren't fit to lead. That you were reckless, too unpredictable. But you've done what an entire unit couldn't." Sarah didn't turn to look at him. Her eyes remained on the forest, her voice calm, steady. "They dismissed me because I didn't fit their mold. But I don't fight to fit their standards. I fight to win. And right now, winning means keeping you alive." Her words carried no arrogance, only truth, and the officers fell silent, realizing that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone forged in fire and sharpened by rejection. The day dragged slowly, the enemy still sweeping the forest, their voices sometimes carrying faintly on the wind. Sarah never lowered her guard, her mind always working, planning the next move, preparing for the inevitable clash. She knew they would come again, stronger, angrier, determined to end her defiance. And when they did, she would meet them with the same fire that had carried her this far. Her body ached, her wounds throbbed, but her spirit was untouchable. For Sarah, this was not just survival, it was proof to herself and to those who had doubted her, that dismissal did not mean defeat. As the sun began to set once more, Sarah adjusted her rifle, tightened the straps of her pack, and looked back at the officers. Her eyes burned with intensity as she spoke. "Rest is over. Nightfall gives us cover and we move again. Stay close, stay silent, and this enemy out there thinks we're already dead. Let's make them believe it until we're clear." And with that, she stepped into the dusk, leading them once more into the shadows of the forest, her resolve unshaken, her legend growing with every step she took. The forest at night was no longer quiet, it was alive with pursuit. Sarah could feel the enemy pressing harder now, their search patterns tightening, their shouts echoing like hounds driving prey toward a kill zone. But Sarah refused to be prey. She guided the 3 officers with relentless precision, moving them through the cover of trees, forcing them into silence even when their lungs begged for air. The ground was rough, the roots and rocks punishing underfoot, but Sarah's focus never wavered. She could sense the enemy squad spreading out ahead, trying to cut off escape routes, and she knew that to make it through she would have to draw their fire away. Sacrifice was the only way, but Sarah had long ago sworn that she would never abandon those under her protection. Her plan would have to be bold, dangerous, and brutally efficient. They reached a clearing where the moonlight poured down like cold silver. Sarah froze, lifting her fist to stop the officers. Her eyes scanned the ground, her ears catching faint metallic clicks, the kind of sound only a seasoned soldier recognized. Mines. The enemy had laid traps across the open ground, forcing them either to turn back into the tightening net or gamble with deadly steps. Sarah crouched, studying the soil, tracing the faint outlines barely visible under the grass. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She reached for a stick, carefully pressing the ground in front of her as she mapped a path. The officers trembled, sweat glistening on their foreheads. Every was calculated, every pause precise. After 15 tense minutes, she guided them across safely, leaving the enemy's cruel trap untouched but neutralized in her mind. She knew it was there and that meant she could use it. Minutes later, as they moved deeper into the woods, she deliberately left markers. Broken branches, footprints pressed just heavy enough, scraps of fabric tied low where a hurried tracker would follow without thinking. It was bait, and she set it with the same patience as a sniper waiting for a target. The officers didn't understand at first, but Sarah knew. When the enemy caught up, they would follow the trail straight into the minefield, and the forest would erupt in chaos. It was not just about killing the enemy, it was about buying time, creating fear, and breaking their rhythm. That was the key to survival, never letting them control the pace. The officers were barely able to stand. Sarah studied the current, fast and merciless, but it was the only way to erase their trail. "We cross," she said, her voice firm. They hesitated, but the tone in her words gave no room for refusal. She entered first, the icy water biting into her skin, dragging at her legs, threatening to sweep her downstream. She fought against it, her muscles straining, every ounce of training pushed to its limit. One by one, she guided the officers across, forcing them forward, her hands gripping their vests whenever they faltered. By the time they reached the opposite bank, all of them were soaked and trembling but alive. Sarah's body burned with exhaustion, yet she still scanned the treeline, rifle ready. Rest was not an option. Suddenly, the forest behind them lit up with flashes, explosions and screams ripping through the night. The minefield had been sprung just as Sarah planned. The officers turned to look, but Sarah didn't. She already knew the devastation her trap had caused, and she also knew it wouldn't stop the enemy completely. It would only slow them, maybe scatter their formation, but they would regroup and they would come again, angrier and more desperate. "Move," she ordered, her tone sharp. They obeyed. Without question now. As dawn broke, the four of them reached higher ground, the forest thinning into jagged cliffs overlooking the valley. From here, Sarah could see smoke rising in the distance, the faint shapes of enemy convoys still combing the terrain. She crouched low, motioning for the officers to rest behind a line of boulders while she scouted ahead. Her boots crunched softly on gravel as she studied the cliffs, searching for a path down. Her map memory told her they were only 10 miles from the extreme. 10 miles with pursuit this heavy, might as well have been 100. Still, Sarah refused to let doubt take hold. 10 miles was survivable. 10 miles was possible. But survival meant risk, and risk meant blood. She returned to the officers, who now looked at her with a kind of reverence, as though she were something beyond human. She ignored their stares and spoke with calm clarity. "The path ahead is steep. If you lose focus, you fall. If you fall, you die. We move carefully, no noise, no hesitation. Understand?" Their nods were shaky but obedient. Sarah led them along the cliffside, every step careful, her body balanced with the grace of someone who had done this 100 times before. At one point, loose rock slid under an officer's boot, and Sarah's hand shot out instantly, gripping his arm with iron strength, pulling him back from the edge. His wide eyes met hers, filled with fear and gratitude, but Sarah said nothing. She just kept moving. Halfway down, the inevitable happened. Gunfire cracked from above as enemy soldiers spotted them. Bullets chipped stone, sparking off the cliffside as the officers pressed themselves flat against the rock. Sarah, however, didn't hesitate. She raised her rifle, leaned out just far enough, and fired upward with surgical accuracy. Each shot was deliberate, each recoil absorbed with perfect control. Enemies fell one after another, their bodies tumbling down the slope. But more gunfire followed, louder, heavier, forcing Sarah to adapt. She motioned the officers to keep moving down while she drew fire, her body twisting and ducking as bullets tore through the air around her. At one point, a round grazed her arm, searing pain shooting through. Calm. When she finally descended to the bottom of the cliffs, her body was streaked with blood and dirt, her rifle hot from the relentless fire. The officers were there, alive, shaken but safe, staring at her with disbelief. She didn't pause to acknowledge their awe. "We're close," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her arm. "But they won't stop. From here on, every second counts." They moved again, deeper into the valley, and Sarah could feel the weight of the mission pressing harder. Every decision she had made so far had kept them alive, but the enemy was relentless. The forest no longer felt like cover, it felt like a battlefield waiting to erupt. Yet Sarah's resolve never cracked. Every rejection, every dismissal she had endured from those who doubted her echoed in her mind, fueling her determination. They had said she was unfit, that she was reckless, that she could not lead. But here she was, leading 3 men who now owed their lives to her, carving a path of survival through sheer will and unshakable skill. As night began to fall again, Sarah found a small ridge overlooking the valley floor. She crouched, studying the terrain ahead, the extraction point hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. She knew the enemy would mount one final push, a desperate attempt to reclaim their pride and their prisoners. Her body ached, her wounds screamed, but her spirit burned hotter than ever. She adjusted her rifle, checked her knife, and whispered the same mantra that had carried her through every impossible moment: precision, speed, resolve. The fight was not over, not yet. And Sarah was ready to show the world once more why dismissal would never mean defeat. The second night came down heavy and suffocating, the forest cloaked in shadows that twisted with every flicker of the wind. Sarah crouched low behind the ridge, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead with the calm of a predator, while the 3 rescued officers huddled silently behind her. The extraction point was close now, she could almost feel it in her bones, but the danger had never been greater. She knew the enemy would not allow them to slip through quietly. They had been embarrassed, slaughtered, and outmaneuvered by a single soldier who their commanders had dismissed, and now vengeance fueled their pursuit. Sarah could sense them tightening their net, circling like wolves hungry for blood. Every step forward would have to be fought for. She rose slowly, motioning for the officers to stay low, and began leading them down the slope. The night air was sharp, biting into her lungs, and every sound seemed amplified: the crunch of boots on leaves, the whisper of branches and behind her. Then came the faint metallic click ahead, and Sarah froze instantly. Her hand shot up, signaling silence, her eyes narrowing into the dark. From the shadows emerged the shapes of enemy soldiers, their rifles raised, their voices murmuring sharp orders. It was an ambush, carefully laid, and Sarah knew they had run out of room to slip away unseen. The officers tensed, fear radiating off them like heat, but Sarah was calm. She reached into her vest, pulling a small smoke grenade, and whispered just loud enough for them to hear: "When the smoke drops, run left. Don't stop. Don't look back." They hesitated, eyes wide, but the steel in her voice left no room for argument. In one swift motion, she pulled the pin and hurled the grenade into the open. The night exploded with thick, choking smoke. Gunfire erupted instantly, flashes tearing through the haze, bullets slicing the air. Sarah was already moving, her rifle barking with ruthless precision, every shot cutting down a silhouette before it could advance. The officers ran as ordered, stumbling through the smoke toward cover, while Sarah stayed behind, fighting like a storm. She shifted positions constantly, never giving the enemy a clean line, her movements fluid and deadly. At one point, a soldier lunged out of the haze, his knife glinting, but Sarah met him head-on, twisting his wrist until the blade dropped, then driving her knee into his ribs before finishing him with a quick strike of steel. Her body burned, her wounds screamed, but she never slowed, never faltered. To the enemy she was a phantom in the smoke, untouchable and merciless. When the smoke began to clear, Sarah finally pulled back, sprinting after the officers. She found them crouched behind fallen logs, their faces pale, their eyes filled with both terror and awe. She didn't waste breath on comfort. "Move," she ordered, pushing them forward. They obeyed instantly now, their trust in her absolute. They had seen enough to know that she was the only reason they were still breathing. Hours dragged by as they pushed deeper into the valley. The extraction zone was less than 2 miles away, but the enemy was relentless. Gunfire echoed in the distance, searchlights pierced through gaps in the canopy, and the howls of dogs carried on the wind. Sarah guided the officers with flawless precision, using the terrain to shield them, laying traps with the few remaining tools in her pack, and doubling back to erase trails. Every decision was a razor's edge, but she walked it without hesitation. Then, as dawn began to stain the horizon with pale light, they reached the final ridge. Below them lay the extraction point, a clearing wide enough for a helicopter, marked with faint beacons hidden from all but trained eyes. Relief rippled through the officers, but Sarah felt none. Her instincts told her what her eyes confirmed: enemy forces were already there, lying in wait. Trucks and soldiers ringed the clearing, machine guns trained toward the skies, determined to ensure no rescue would succeed. It was a kill zone, and walking into it meant certain death. The officers looked to Sarah, panic returning to their faces. "What now?" one whispered, his voice shaking. Sarah's gaze was cold, unyielding. "Now we fight." She studied the field, counting positions, memorizing weapon placements, calculating timing down to the second. There were too many to fight head-on, but Sarah never fought. She fought with intelligence, with precision, with resolve that could not be broken. She led the officers in a wide arc, circling behind the enemy line. From their position they could see the rear trucks, lightly guarded, filled with ammunition. Sarah's eyes narrowed. That was the key. She crept forward, every movement controlled, and planted the last of her explosives along the trucks. Her hands moved quickly despite the tremor of exhaustion, her mind locked in absolute focus. When the charges were set, she motioned the officers back, whispering one word, "Wait." Minutes later, as the first helicopter rotors thundered faintly in the distance, Sarah detonated the explosives. The trucks erupted in fire, a chain reaction of fuel and ammunition that shook the valley like thunder. Chaos exploded through the enemy ranks, soldiers shouting, gunfire spraying wildly, command lines burning. Sarah used the chaos like a blade, striking swiftly from the shadows, cutting down any soldier who tried to regroup. Her rifle spat fire, her knife flashed, her body moving with the lethal rhythm of someone who had accepted pain as part of life. The officers followed behind her, ducking low, firing when they could, but always shielded by Sarah's unyielding presence. By the time the helicopter descended, the clearing was no longer an ambush site, it was a battlefield scorched by Sarah's fury. She pushed the officers toward the landing zone, covering them with relentless fire, her body refusing to quit even as blood soaked her sleeve and her lungs burned. Soldiers tried to regroup, but Sarah cut them down, one after another, until finally the officers were pulled into the safety of the chopper. The crew shouted for Sarah to board, but she didn't move at first. Her rifle was no enemy dared step forward. Only when the last of them fell silent did she finally step back, climbing aboard with the same steady composure she had carried since the beginning. As the helicopter lifted, the officers stared at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. One of them finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "They said you didn't belong. That you weren't fit to lead. But you just saved us all." Sarah sat against the wall of the chopper, her rifle across her lap, her eyes fixed on the fading battlefield below. Her voice was quiet, steady, but laced with unshakable strength. "They dismissed me. But dismissal doesn't decide who you are. Actions do." The officers nodded silently, knowing they had witnessed something unforgettable. As the helicopter carried them into safety, Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind wash over her. She knew this wasn't the end. The fight would continue, the doubts would return, the challenges would only grow. But none of that mattered. She had faced the impossible and she had won. Not for recognition, not for glory, but because it was who she was. A soldier forged in fire, dismissed by commanders but proven by battle. A woman who had taken down 15 enemies in 5 minutes and carried 3 men across the jaws of death. And as the sun rose higher, painting the sky in fire, Sarah knew she would never be dismissed again. The end.